Hey everybody, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Westminster Wednesday, where each week we take one question from the Westminster Shorter Catechism and we explore its meaning and its significance for our lives today. Back in question 7, we talked about the decrees of God, and we saw that God foreordains whatever comes to pass, from the greatest events of world history down to the smallest events of our lives. And then in question 8, we learned that God executes or carries out his decrees in two ways, in the works of creation and in the works of providence. And we talked about how God isn't just the creator of all things, but he is the governor of all things. He governs all things through his providence. In today's question, we're going to explore that notion of providence a little bit more deeply. And question number 11 asks this. It asks, what are God's works of providence? And the answer is, God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing all his creatures and all their actions. Now, I want you to notice in that answer that it says God both preserves and governs all his creatures and all their actions. What that means is that every single breath we take is only because of God's preserving hand. It means every single step that we take and movement that we make is only because of God's governing hand. He governs all things, all of our actions, according to his good purposes. And this doesn't just include the actions of human beings, but other creatures as well, the actions of animals, the things that happen with plants, and all of the different aspects of his creation. God governs it all. R.C. Sproul, the great theologian R.C. Sproul, once famously said, if there is one maverick molecule in all the universe, then God is not sovereign. And if God is not sovereign, he said, God is not God. So God governs all the actions of every creature in his creation. Now, when people hear this, sometimes they immediately ask, well, then does that mean that human beings are just robots or that we don't have any free will? And the answer is no. Back in episode 7, we talked about this a little bit, and we said that human beings, according to Scripture, do have free will and do make free choices and are responsible for those choices. And yet somehow, in the mystery of God's providence, all of our choices, all of our actions fall within the overarching plan of God, and nothing falls outside of his sovereign plan and outside of his providence. As Proverbs 16:9 says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And this means there is no such thing as luck. There's no such thing as chance. There is no such thing as coincidence. Since God preserves and governs all of his creatures and all of their actions, then everything that happens in this world and in our lives happens for a reason. Everything that takes place according to the sovereign plan and purposes of God. And this means that no matter what's happening in our lives, we can have confidence that the things that are happening for a reason, and God has a plan that is being worked out. Now, when it comes to providence, we need to understand that most of God's providence is invisible to us. What I mean by that is most of his providence happens behind the scenes. Sometimes you will hear theologians talk about God's extraordinary providence versus his ordinary providence. And what we mean by that is God's ordinary providence is when God works through ordinary means to accomplish his purposes. And God's extraordinary providence is when God works apart from any means to accomplish his purposes. So to give you a couple of examples, ordinarily, God provides food for his people by sending the rain and by means of not only the rain, but causing the crops to grow. That's ordinary providence. But God can also provide through extraordinary providence, such as when he did for the Israelites by sending manna straight directly from heaven to provide food for them. To give another example, ordinarily God heals people through the means of doctors and through the means of medicines. That's ordinary providence. But God can also heal through extraordinary providence by healing people directly, just like he did with King Hezekiah when Hezekiah prayed for healing and God healed him directly and extended his life. And so normally God works behind the scenes. Normally God works through what we call ordinary providence to accomplish his purposes. Sometimes, occasionally, he works through extraordinary providence. He works apart from any means to accomplish his purposes. But the important thing to remember is that whether he works through ordinary providence or extraordinary providence, it's all God who is doing all the work. He is the one who governs all things and governs them according to his sovereign plan and his good purposes. Now, there's one final thing I want you to notice here in question number 11, and that is that God's works of providence are holy and wise. Notice it says, God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful preserving and governing of his creatures and all of their actions. What that means is that we can trust that God governs in a way that is good and that is always good and that is always wise. We can trust that God is governing things in a way that is good because God is holy. And we can trust that he is always using the best means to achieve the best ends because God is infinitely wise. We may not always see God's goodness, and we may not always understand his wisdom in the ways that he is choosing to govern the world. But in the end, God is going to demonstrate that all things that he has done were done according to his good purposes and his good plan. One of the greatest examples of this in Scripture is the cross. When Jesus went to the cross and was crucified, it appeared from a human perspective as though the plan of God had failed. It appeared that evil had won the day, and yet when Jesus rose from the dead 3 days later, it became evident that all of this that had happened for a reason. It all had happened according to the sovereign plan and the purposes of God, and every event that led up to it was governed by God's providence. The prayer of believers in Acts chapter 4 reflects this reality so beautifully. When the believers are praying in Acts 4, they say, "Truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place." You see, those believers understood that all of the wicked things that were done that sent Jesus to the cross were actually part of God's providential plan, and that it was all according to what God had predestined to take place, to the end that salvation would be brought to the world. And so the cross was no accident. It was part of God's sovereign plan, and we can trust that everything that happens in our lives is part of God's governing according to his providence as well. Even though we may not understand why certain things happen, even though we don't always see the goodness of God around us, we can trust that he is governing all things and he is guiding them according to his good purposes. And in the end, God will demonstrate that he has done all things well.